Today is the last of our sermon series of Tested Faith in the Struggle, and today it's entitled Abandoned. Scripture reference is John 16, 15 through 21. As we continue this series today, we'll dig into an area of testing that is one most, if not all of us, have experienced or will at some point in our life experience. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt alone and abandoned? What did it feel like? The thought of being abandoned is one of the tests we'll face in life. When you're in that position, where will you turn? The feeling of abandonment is a powerful tool of the enemy because when we feel isolated and alone, we start listening to those small voices in our heads that keep getting louder and louder. Think of Jesus for a moment. Who came calling when Jesus was alone, tired, thirsty, hungry in the wilderness? When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, what did Jesus do? Jesus cried out to God to find another way. The temptation to avoid the cross was something he faced. In the most powerful verse in this sermon of subject of feeling abandoned, listen to Jesus in Matthew 27:46. About 3 o'clock, Jesus shouted in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus felt the pain of abandonment on the cross. This morning's text takes us to a time when Jesus spoke to his closest disciples. This event takes place shortly before the crucifixion, and after spending time with Jesus, the disciples are told that their relationship will soon be severed. Jesus tells them of his coming departure and that it will be soon. At this point, the disciples are in a state of shock, disillusionment. Their best friend and mentor will no longer be with them, and they're taking the news very hard. Most would have reacted the way the disciples did. We probably would have reacted this way because we lack the entire scope of Jesus' plan. Out of context, this reality seems harsh and unnecessary and even faulty. If we were to drive to work every day and observe the daily progress of a unique building being constructed, we might be a little judgmental about its progress. Our lack of ability to see the blueprints makes us doubt whether it would ever be finished. I remember when I was teaching at the college down at the C.P. Gibbs campus, they were redoing a whole building. They didn't just remodel it, they just demolished it and started over again. And they kept going and going. And I told my director, I says, man, they're going at a glacial pace here. They're really, really slow, And it was hard to understand how beautiful it was going to be until I actually taught in that building later on. It's very nice. But, we don't understand sometimes when we see things in progress. Similarly, the disciples didn't understand the big picture of what Jesus was trying to accomplish. We act like that too when we can't see what God is doing in our lives. Without answers, we tend to object to the process we're going through. The main point of the message today is, when Christ warned his disciples that he would be leaving them, they didn't take the news very well. He left them with words of comfort and admonition to help them overcome this test of their life. But let's begin with John 16 and 17. In a little while you will see me no longer. Again, after a little while you will see me. Then some of his disciples said to another, what's the meaning of what he's saying? In a little while you will not see me. Again, after a little while you will see me. And because I'm going to the Father. Brings us to our first point today. The sorrow brought by abandonment. In verses 16 through 24, Jesus is with the disciples. He speaks to the joys and sorrows they will face in the coming days. Even though Jesus had talked about his death and subsequent resurrection, The disciples were deeply saddened by the statement that Jesus made, telling him they would see him no more longer. I've heard stories of children having one or both parents abandon them. It was a heartbreaking time. This plays out in divorces, where typically the father is nowhere to be found after divorce, and this leaves emotional scars the children carry with them for the rest of their lives. I remember a woman in this congregation who talked about a time in her life. I think she was 9 years old, and her mother took her to the orphanage and left her. Now, I myself lived in an orphanage for about 6 months, but I didn't know it because I was only a little bitty baby, And my dad adopted me when I was 6 months old. So although I lived that time, I don't remember anything about that. But another thing we see all the time, volunteers at animal shelters often remark it is heartbreaking to see dogs and cats who had homes dumped at the shelter. Whoever thinks animals cannot love and get attached doesn't have a clue. Abandonment brings sorrow. The disciples were sad they had no clue as to what was happening with Jesus. Verse 17 shows that they had no clue. When we lose people around us, we feel abandoned. When we feel abandoned, it can affect our desire to live life. Before anyone ever heard of COVID, 1 out of 2 Americans could be classified as lonely. That sense of feeling alone left out was a global epidemic prior to the global pandemic. Experts say loneliness can shorten a person's lifespan by as much as 15 years. Former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy stated, "During my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness. 1 in 6 baby boomers lives alone. 1 out of 2 people don't know their neighbors' names. And Generation Z, 18 through 22, and Millennials, 23 through 37, have the highest rate of loneliness." You'd think that these young people from the commercials you see and stuff, they're all having parties and great, but it's not true. High rates of loneliness. Many around us are quite lonely. The disciples were used to being with Jesus, yet he was telling them that he would be leaving them for a while. In verse 16, Jesus spoke specifically about his death and resurrection. After 3 days, he would rise again, and for another little while, a space of about 40 days, before he ascended to the Father, they would see him while he remained on the earth. Of course, these men had no idea what he was speaking of at this point, and add to that fact, they didn't want him to go. When we're alone and afraid, the enemy will use that time to attack, and we must be ready for it. We have not to allow sorrow to ruin our faith. It can. John 16, 18 through 19. So, they kept on repeating, what's the meaning of this? What he says in a little while, we did not understand what he's talking about. Jesus could see that they wanted to ask him about these things, and so he said to them, "Are you asking each other about this, that I said in a little while you will not see me? Again, after a little while, you will see me?" Well, that brings us to our second point. The confusion brought about by abandonment. Point 2 should also include verse 17. So, then some of his disciples said to one another, "What's the meaning of what he's saying? In a little while you'll not see me again, and after a while you will see me, and because I'm going to the Father." In verse 18 it says, so they were saying. So they're still talking about this. They're just not sure what he's meaning. In the original language, they were saying it is in the imperfect sense, a tense. In language, tense tells you the time frame in which the word is being written. The imperfect is when a time past tense verb is brought into the future. It's an ongoing, repeated, habitual past action. It's not a one and done. It's like a simple past tense. In other words, the disciples were so dumbfounded and confused that they repeatedly said to themselves and to one another, "What does he mean? What does he mean? What's he talking about?" How many times during a testing in life do we try to figure out what God is doing in our lives? We sit, we ask questions, and we ponder the meaning of it all. The wonderful thing is that God knows what we're asking. In verse 19, Jesus knew what was happening in his disciples' hearts. He takes time to comfort them in verse 20. And think of that child or pet that gets left behind. They're dumbfounded, confused, and scarred. Jesus' speech quickly causes a buzz of discussion among the disciples. The focus of conversation is neither the prophecy about coming persecution nor the promise of the Holy Spirit. It is centered on Jesus' still misunderstood references to his coming departure. The disciples are confused about his future destination, about the timing of the coming sequence of events. In verses 7 and 10, Jesus told these men that he would be leaving. The confusion of the disciples centered around the fact that Jesus said he would not see them for a little while. And then for a little while they would see him. These guys did not know how this was possible. When we feel abandoned, our confusion can lead us to surmise that God has left us, and the enemy will play on that feeling. The test is, will I stick with Jesus even if I feel he's left me? Which of course he didn't. John 16, 20 and 21. I tell you the solemn truth, you will weep and wail, but the world will rejoice. You will be sad, but your sadness will turn to joy. When a woman gives birth, she has distress because her time has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the suffering because of her joy that the human being has been born into this world. Which brings me to the last point today, the end of abandonment. Jesus here shows the disciples that their profound grief in connection with his death. He tells them that they would weep and wail, and yet, while they're weeping and wailing, the death of Jesus will make his enemies rejoice. The Jewish leaders in particular were so hostile toward Jesus, would be filled with joy thinking he would be out of the picture, rotting in the tomb. This sounds bad, however, something will change. The disciples' sorrow would be turned to joy by the resurrection of Jesus. We are later told that when the disciples returned to Jerusalem after the ascension, the disciples were full of joy. Now, while we may not have specific answers to our questions, why questions, God does comfort us during our most vulnerable seasons of life. Jesus tells the disciples what they needed to know at that moment. They needed to know that eventually his absence would bring about joy in the future. Jesus illustrates this point by talking about a woman in labor. The woman is not enjoying the painful process of giving birth, but once that baby is delivered and handed to the mother, it's as though she never went through birth pains at all. Jesus is saying that's how they'll feel when they see him again. The same is true for us in our tests of life. There's joy after the pain. Jesus is always with you. Always. You're never alone. During the rough times, you can get through it with him. Psalm 23. A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He takes me to lush pastures. He leads me to refreshing water. He restores my strength. He leads me down the right paths for the sake of his reputation. Even when I must walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger. For you are with me, and your rod and your staff reassure me. You prepare a feast before me in the plain sight of my enemies. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is completely full. Surely your goodness and faithfulness will pursue me all my days, and I will live in the Lord's house for the rest of my life. Fear of the unknown is often associated with tests. We need to know that God is always with us. What's going to be the test? What's going to be on that test? What is it going to be? Multiple choice? How many essays or fill in the blanks will there be? Will we test it over all the material or just a few main points? Likewise, the tests of life bring fear that causes many to worry about what will be on the tests. Truthfully, no one but God knows. We know that the author of the test is also the one who is with you during the test. Psalm 23 tells us that even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is with us. We are never alone. God will not leave you alone and afraid. Well, brings us to the question today. Are you feeling abandoned or depressed this morning? Can you really believe that God is right there with you? Can you see through the sorrow and pain to a future that's bright and wonderful in God's kingdom? Whatever you need this morning, will you come forward as we stand and sing a song of invitation?